Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks. I am your host, Carolyn Hines, and this is the podcast slash YouTube channel where I talk to film creators about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today I am joined by filmmaker and animator Wei Li to talk about his film Tehura, which showed at the 2022 Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. And this is an animated film. It's a short film, but it's one that I actually relate to a lot. As you guys know, I am Barbadian. I'm from the Caribbean. And while the film is set in Tahiti, which is otherwise known as French Polynesia, there's some cultural similarities, and the story that he's telling that I related to a lot, and something that I speak about in my work as a critic. So I can't wait to talk to Wei about this. But before we begin, as usual, I like to have my guests say a bit about themselves and what got them involved in filmmaking, and in his case, and animating as well. So Wei, thank you so much for joining me. Yay.
So much for having me.
Thank you. So tell me, how did you start out being an animator?
Yeah, earlier we were having a little chat. You were telling me about your previous career and your education, and you completely diverged. It's similar for me too. I went to business school, and I got my degree as well, but never pursued it. I don't have it hung up on my wall because I didn't even go and collect it. I was so like, oh, screw this. But throughout business school, I was just drawing a lot. And initially, after graduating, I actually started doing comics on my own and self-publishing. But then eventually I realized that I really needed to learn how to draw if I wanted to pursue this seriously. And so I went back to school for animation just for 2 years, initially just to learn how to draw. But, there's an animation industry here in Vancouver. So it was something that you can get a job in that, I kind of like, drawing. So that's kind of how I got into animation. Yeah.
And was there like any particular style of animation that you're drawn to? Because for like Tehura, the animation style is very distinct. It's not like very typical. Like the lines are very fluid, which I think kind of mimics the dance that's done in the film. Is I think it's Ote'a. So it's a traditional Tahitian dance, and like I love how you like use the animation to tell that line of the story as well. So is that a style that you've used before, and is it one that you were drawn to, or is it just one that you picked specifically to tell this story?
So I'm actually not an animator. Before this film, I didn't animate except except to learn how to animate in school. I didn't work as an animator. I worked mainly as a storyboard artist.
Okay.
Yeah.
But wait,
and
isn't technically storyboarding also animation? Or is there a distinction? There's a very big distinction. Could you explain it?
So storyboarding is I take the script and I essentially determine the cinematography, the staging, how the whole film's going to look. I draw it out first without animation. And then it's then sent to the animators. And if it's 3D, they use the assets to animate it. If it's 2D, even nowadays, there are still 2D assets that they use to animate based on the storyboards. So yeah, it's quite different. But there is, as storyboarding becomes more and more competitive, if you will, there are people who pretty much animate in their storyboards, which is a ton of work, and that seep a little bit into my work. So it did get me thinking a bit more about animation, but in terms of like actual animating, I didn't do it until this film. And to answer your question, is there a particular animation style? Oh man, that's a hard one. I suppose there are some more independent, or yeah, I guess one film that comes to mind is My Neighbor, the Yamatas, which is not an independent film. It's a Ghibli film from the 90s. And I just love the mark making they used in the film, in the sense that they, it's not cleaned up. The lines are not cleaned up. It's very, you can see the brush strokes. You can see the animator's hand. You can see the artist's hand. And I really like that quality, especially for moments in my film where it is about her relationship with her art form, her relationship with how the dance feels. And I love that like sense of imperfection in the brushstrokes. And it's not the polished and performative type of work we see on the stage when the dancers are performing for the audience. Rather, it's when I was in Tahiti and I was trying to understand and learn more about the dance and the culture, it's more when they're practicing that really drew me in. Because you really see the humanity when someone's trying to get better, trying to perfect something, and so it's that influenced the style of dance as well as the style of animation.
Right. Okay. So before we get there, so storyboarding is more static art, while the animation is the movement and the art becoming alive. Okay. For some reason I've always thought of storyboarding as a type of animation, but it's not. Thank you for explaining that.
No worries.
So like talking now about Tehura, like I love like when you say that it's not perfected. I love that aspect of the film because it's very raw, and there is a beauty in it being unfinished because it fits the story that's being told. Because like for Tehura, there is moments like in the second half of the film where she is becoming raw. She's not doing the perfected dance of the practice movements of someone who's just performing just because this is her job. Once she starts to really tap into her artistry and her culture and her history, it becomes the rawness fits, especially when it becomes about the storm too. But before we get there, you talked about learning about Tahiti and the culture and the dance, the Ote'a. So why did you choose this to be the story that you would tell for your first animated film? Like, what was it that drew you in about the dance and about the culture that you said, this is what I want to tell. This is a story I want to tell first?
Yeah, so I mean, initially it was a very naive and kind of boring origin story. I just really wanted to make a short film. And then my friend suggested the setting in French Polynesia, and I love dance, so I was just like, oh, what would that kind of look like? But as I start to research into it and look into that dance culture, I realized I couldn't approach such a story without addressing Orientalism and without addressing my own male gaze and without addressing the body politics. And it's not just that it fascinated me, but it's more that it challenged me and my worldviews to such a degree that I couldn't let it go as a story. But I also knew that not being Tahitian and not being a female dancer, there was a question whether I should tell the story at all. And so that's why I decided to go to Tahiti to answer that question. And I was prepared to come back realizing I shouldn't tell the story at all. So I emailed a bunch of dance chiefs, dancers, and schools. I didn't know anyone in Tahiti. I went, and to my surprise, everyone was. It wasn't that they were just so generous. It's that they really welcomed me with the attitude and the philosophy of how they approach art and community as intrinsically linked. And they really provided me with so much unconditional support that at the end, I felt like I had to finish the film to reciprocate what they gave me, or else I would be a lie.
Yeah. So when you got there and you were talking with them and you told them, like you as you said, you didn't first initially have the idea of telling it from the aspect of colonialism and talking about the culture and the history of the dance and what it symbolizes, especially for the female dancers. When you told them perhaps your original idea, and then as the story started to evolve and you started to say, okay, this is what I want to make it about, what was their response to you, and what did they share about their own experiences? That were any of them also dancers at resorts like Tehura is in the film?
Yeah, so when I went, I already had the idea of addressing Orientalism and the male gaze and whatnot. And it's funny because, there's a language barrier. I don't speak French, and over there it's predominantly French. And to the degree that like the second time I went to Tahiti, I brought a friend who would translate for me. But the first time I went to the school. It's called the Conservatoire de Polynesia. And anyway, the Conservatoire, I was talking to the director and his English wasn't that great. And so he actually thought my film was a love story. He thought it was the exact opposite of what I was going for. He thought it was about a tourist learning to like falling in love and that it was going to be a love story. And so that's how he told my project to one of the art teachers there. Okay. And then within 5 minutes of meeting that art teacher, he invited me to stay with him at his place. And of course, I was very thankful because, and so I went and stayed with him, and he shared this with me. He thought that it was about, like, it was an Orientalist lens. That's what he thought. He was so relieved when he realized my true intention. And he's a dancer himself. And so we would spend, nights talking about what it means to be French, what it means to be Tahitian, contemporary Tahitian, and what it means to live, with this colonialist history. He told me stories of, his grandmother hanging up posters of the nuclear blasts on their coasts that the French government would give them as a propaganda piece of like, you should be proud of this. You should be proud of what your country offers to
the world, the press.
Yeah. And what he told me really influenced my lens of Tahiti. And, when he realized what my project was about, he said, you have to make this because we don't have a story like this. And, that's something that stuck with me. And later on, I met a dancer who eventually became my choreographer. And she told me her whole relationship with the Tahitian dance from being a little kid, because her mother was a dance teacher, was a professional dancer. And so so the choreography, how it worked was it kind of based on her life story, how she, was taught a dance that was very rooted in Tahitian traditions. And then later she, was a rebellious teenager and went against all that and joined something that was more about showing the world, much more performative, and wanting to, be big and grand and modern. And she did that, but then she realized there was this, for lack of a better word, like individualism to that group. And so she left it and went back to her old group where she reconnected with her roots. And so I took kind of that life story of hers and wrote it in poetry form and asked her if it felt true to her. And she said yes. And I asked her if she could choreograph something that tells this story of hers. And then that was like the foundation of the choreography.
We'll get to the choreography in a bit, but I want to start. You mentioned something there about the French government's handing out the pictures of the atom bomb exploding, because for people who don't know, so like just before while they were testing the first set of atomic bombs, like in French Polynesia and in that part of the Pacific Islands, there's Bikini Atoll, as most people know it for, where they tested the atom bombs before dropping them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the islands were devastated for like dozens of years because of the effects of the fallout. So just to think that the French government, a colonialist government, because we know what they've done to Haiti and other countries in the Caribbean and around the world, where they handed out propaganda in the form of pictures of the bomb exploding and said, "This is your sacrifice. We And the people didn't sacrifice themselves. You know, it was the governments, like the European and the North American governments, America, who did the bomb testings, and they were like sending out and saying, you did that, you guys sacrifice, and this is a good for the people. I'm like, no. So like, just to think that they did that, I can't imagine like having that as a part of your history, where it's one thing that it happened, but then for the government to propagandize, I had no idea this. So you mentioned it as the first I've ever heard of that even being done. But like the fact that I know that, I fully believe, because like we've seen how it's happened in other countries and how imperialism is propagandized and spread as this good thing, when we, especially for a lot of people of color, know that the effects of imperialism, especially Western imperialism, it blows my mind, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I can't imagine the anger, because like the anger does come through the film a bit, right?
Yeah, yeah. You know, there were so many stories like that were told to me. It was hard to like pin it down. Of course, there were parts of me that's like, oh, that's such a, maybe I should morph the story to include that. But there's so much, and I, at some point, I just had to focus on just the one part of what I learned over there. Yeah.
If you were to include that, you probably have to make it into a feature film. It's
Yeah.
just so much. And so like, and I mentioned the anger now. So I want you to talk a bit about, we will get to, as I said, the animation style. Actually, no, let's do it. Because the animation style, as I said, it had a very specific feel to it, especially with the music, the way how at first it starts. So Tehura she's a dancer, and she's at a resort, and so she's performing there at night, and there's these two white guys, and they're like, you talked about the male gaze, like for them, her body, the bodies of the dancers are just there for their entertainment. They're just broken down. They're just seen as like either hips or breasts or arms or legs, and they're not like looking at the full body of the performers, or just like the performance itself. It's about the commercialization and the sexualization of culture, and how not only imperialism, but especially particularly Western hypersexualization of women of color in particular plays a big part in how culture has been commodified and commercialized by other countries. So like I mentioned before we began recording, I'm from Barbados. So in the Caribbean, especially, and in Barbados, like our culture has become very commercialized in a way where it's almost like an export product for us. So like we have when tourists come to the islands, they come to be entertained by the people. They come to be entertained by Bajans. They come to be they at the hotels you have like the performance nights where you have local dance troops and drummers and musicians come in, and they perform our culture for these people, for the entertainment of these people. And what these tourists don't understand, or they don't care to understand or to know, is that the songs that are being sung, the dances that are being danced, the music that's being played, all tell very specific stories, and a lot of them tell stories about our culture and our history and our people. But they don't care about that. They just care to be entertained. And Tehura talks about that, where she and the other women they're telling stories in their dance. Like for a lot of people think that for the Ote'a dances and even the hula dances in Hawaii are just dancing, but they don't care that these dances are actually a full language. They're telling actual stories. So talk about that aspect of the film first, and the aspect of this story that you're telling, how you're telling the story of colonization and imperialism within this film and within Tehura's dance itself. Because I want you to talk first about the commercial dance, the dance performed at the hotel, and then the dance that she does, which is like the breakaway, her emotional, and just like her emotional breakaway, she just fed up, and she's like, I can't do this anymore. So talk a bit about those two sides of the performance within the film.
Yeah. So, actually, it's interesting because when I was in Tahiti, I also visited resorts. I also saw these performances. And it's interesting to me because it's all everyone's very polite, everyone's very civilized, like all the tourists, and it's more like it feels more like a respectable show that's happening while people are eating, and then they go and take pictures, and it all feels very, the sexualization is not explicit in the actions of the audience. The sexualization is really in our minds, right? Through all the marketing, through all the imageries that we've associated cultures with. And so I found that really intriguing in the sense that, like, all these tourists came because of those reasons, because of the images they've seen, because of the marketing. And they want to partake in this, but really, there's a bit of discomfort, right? Of like, but I'm a decent human being, I shouldn't, but this is also what drew you here. And so I wanted to make that very explicit, like much more explicit than it is in reality, in the film. Just because I want to see how audience members that would go to a resort like this feel when they see it being more explicitly stated. If the imageries that's put into our heads do play out, what would that look like for them? And I wanted to make that uncomfortable. A lot of people describe the first part of the tourist perspective as being very cringy, which exactly what I'm going for. And so, yeah, in terms of even the dance and the way I drew it, I wanted to be much more graphic, but still respecting the movements and the dance, but without making it feel expressive, if that makes sense. Especially like not expressive with a voice. Yeah, I wanted to feel voiceless, I suppose. And then for the second part, as I mentioned earlier, it's much more influenced by the moments when the dancers are practicing in Tahiti, because it's in those practices where you really feel the sense of community. When it's a performance, it's about the performance, it's about executing perfectly. It's not about acknowledging each other. It's about facing the audience and putting on the smile. Whereas in the practices, they're not smiling. They're sweaty and they're just going hard at it, but they're also cheering each other on with I don't know what's the right word. They do this calling, which what Tehura does right before her final dance to signal to the musicians, and it's this almost like battle cry, to cheer each other to keep going. And I love the moments where they're taking breaks to drink water, to share snacks, and all the families watching. You really get much more of that community sense. And that's why, even though I'm not a big fan of flashbacks in general, I would just want it. I wanted to show a glimpse of that sense of practice in a community, in that dominated most of her life. That should dominate what the dance means to her.
No, that makes sense, because that's who she is, and that's who these women are, and that's how the community is. Because like the same thing, like back home when we're before, like, I used to be in a choir too, so and I used to dance when I was in secondary and primary school. So when you're practicing, that's how we really are. Like that's where you really see the community, and that's where you hear us talking in our dialect and in our accents, and we're not worried about impressing the tourists. We're not worried about executing a perfect performance that reflects positively on like the group or the hotel that you're representing it or whatever concert you're performing at. And I would say there is also a difference when you're performing, from my own experience and from women and other people that I've seen as performers in, like, because I've been to Cuba as well, where I stayed at a hotel where like the same thing happened. And there's a difference between when you're performing in front of your own people, even if it's just like an actual performance where you're performing in front of your own people versus where you're performing for people who are not of your culture. There's still that sense of community. There's still that sense of funness because you're at home. This is where you are home. And when you're performing for like tourists, especially who are usually predominantly white, European or American or North American, there's this idea that we have to impress them, that we have to show them that we can be just as perfect or more perfect than they are. And I think it's just such a perversive psychological effect of colonization and colonialism, where we as people of color, we've been conditioned to believe that who we are culturally and who we are like ethnically isn't good enough, that we still have to put on this performance. We have to, like you're talking about, like the film talks about that, where like we can't be sweaty. We're not supposed to be sweaty, we're supposed to all perfectly put together. And even for these same women, for these same dancers, even though their costumes are their traditional wear, to other people would seem skimpy, quote unquote, like they're still like, that's who they are, they still have to look a particular way in these outfits, and they're not respected for the outfits having a particular purpose, or how the outfits reflect their culture and who they are as a people. And so this time when I watched this film, like I was just like, I'm like, I can really relate to this film, because it kind of because it reminded me of a conversation, a thread I had made on Twitter not too long ago, where this artist, singer, she wore a costume, what we would call a costume for carnival, for like and she was saying she would wear it for Halloween. And I remember I made a thread, and it's like, like carnival costumes, particularly like in Barbados we call it crop over, but it's like they're skimpy, they're like basically bathing suits with like sequins and feathers and whatever. And people who aren't from the culture just see it as, they're just these sexy outfits, it's just these sexy things. And like, she's like, I'm gonna wear it for Halloween. And I made it start saying, like, these aren't for Halloween. Carnival and crop over, these are not for Halloween. It's not about it's not like representing a pagan religion, because Halloween came out is like considered a pagan event. And I'm like, for us, for the Caribbean, for people in the Caribbean, Carnival and crop over came out of slavery. It was how Black enslaved people were celebrated their freedom, like at the end of harvest, that's the only time, like maybe 1 or 2 days out of an entire year, where they got to play their traditional instruments. They got to play their music from across in Africa. So I was very upset. I'm like, you people keep seeing the Caribbean and these cultures as just like entertainment. I'm like, these outfits have a meaning to us, the colors, the music, the dance, it has meaning. So that was like legit a couple of weeks before release. So then when I saw your film, I was just like, this is basically like what I was talking about in my thread.
Totally. Yeah. It's also interesting to me that, what I understand is that the clothing they wear for the performances have specific meaning. It also does feel like more for example, they have this event called the Tehura. They have various competitions, but the Tehura is the biggest one. And they would spend months making all the costumes, all the outfits for the Tehura. And actually, one of the dance chiefs, at one point I was hanging out with him, and I was like helping make some of the outfits. So intricate, so much materials. And it does feel like when they're, like for the Tehura, when they're performing for each other, that sense of history and cultural significance of the outfits come out. But at the same time, I wanted to, for the purpose of the short film, I wanted to get across that the dance is, part of their everyday life. They spend more time dancing in just modern regular clothes than they do in the performative outfits, and that there's a every day-to-day, moment-to-moment meaning behind the dance, and what role it plays in their life, beyond how it's embodied in the outfits. I thought that was maybe that was something that was interesting in trying to explore.
Mm-hmm. Right. And in talking about now the meaning of the dance and the meaning of the costumes, let's talk about the meaning of Tehura's dance, because I interpreted her dance comes across to me as very it's very emotional, and it's very, to me, it reads also as very angry. Like she's very angry, and like you can tell she's calling back to her memory. Like you mentioned the flashbacks, and the flashbacks is of her training and practicing with her group as a young girl, and she's watching the elders. They're dancing, they're inspiring her and teaching her about the culture and about their history in these dances. And she's while she's performing her to me, it's like a dance of reclamation. Like she's reclaiming her identity as a Tahitian, and as a Tahitian dancer. In these flashbacks, she's remembering the practices that she did as a young girl, and she's remembering the elders, and she's mimicking the movements, because like the movements are about like calling on their ancestors and calling on their history, and it's inspiring her. So talk about just like you, as you mentioned, like your friend, she was the one who choreographed this, and you loosely based it on her experience. So talk about just the emotionality of the dance itself and the choreography, but then translating that as an animation, because as I said earlier, I love how raw the animation style is for this, and it feels very fluid and very natural, and the lines of the animation follow that style. So talk a bit about just watching the dance and choreographing this as an animator, the challenges, because it could not have been easy.
Yeah, the anger. Yeah, it's interesting because given the emotional narrative of the story in the film specifically, I did feel like it had to start with anger, but then it had to transition to something deeper than anger, right? That something, her connection with her community that ends up, for lack of a better word, at least in that moment, healing her. That sense that, as dancers, sometimes that happens. You might start out because you're angry, or you're defiant, or you want to get rid of some kind of feeling, and as you go through it, there's a bit of healingness to it. You're able to overcome that anger at the end, by the end, right? So I wanted to get that across, and it was tricky, and it was tricky to plan out that arc and to make it convincing to move from anger to where she is at the end. Sorry, I forgot your question.
No, it's okay. Like so talk about this the working with the choreographer. She is oh my gosh, I have to read it here, but I can't even read my own handwriting.
No worries.
Working with her, but then also the dancer who plays Tehura, she talk about working with them. Did the two of them work together? Like she would have had to work with her to show her the choreography and everything, right?
The dancer, so she did the dance. The choreographer Nahima also did the dance. The voice of
right.
Tehura is someone else, but she didn't need to. She's also a dancer, but she didn't need to perform the dance for me to animate it. Yeah, Nahima choreographed and did the dance as I recorded her movements and her dance, so that I can reference it. But it was mainly just recorded from one angle, so all the so it wasn't like rotoscoped or anything. It was all the camera moves and all the camera moves and different angles. It's all like based on what I came up with.
Oh, how you envisioned it from a 3D
how I envisioned it.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And even there are certain parts of like the pacing of her movements and the animation that I differed from Nahima's choreography, or from her videos at least, because I wanted to, linger in certain poses, speed up in certain poses to further the emotionality, but still trying to do it within the parameters of what makes a dance authentic and traditional in the lens of Ori Tahiti.
And how long did it take you to just animate that one sequence alone? Because it's a pretty lengthy sequence. So like, how long did it take you to start from the first set of animation, from observing the video till the end, where you're like, okay, now the film is complete? This is like, how long did it take you to do that?
So, and that was actually one of the first sequences I animated.
Okay.
Just because initially my reasoning was because it was most difficult, but I think it's actually because I was most interested in doing it. It was the scene that just excited me the most, and I think that's probably why I started animating it first. And while it is very difficult, it was also the most fun. And so the difficulty didn't stick in my mind as much as some of the other scenes. It's the tedious, boring scenes that really was felt more draining to me, whereas this one, it was just more exciting. And the fact that the lines are so rough, and it also makes it more forgiving, right? And so, and I wanted that feeling of I was trying to channel the feeling that I saw of the dancers practicing, that sense of rawness, of pushing oneself, while not necessarily even towards perfection, but beyond the limits, even if there's flawedness to it. And trying to capture that sense of beauty. It's actually the scenes in the beginning of the film that were a lot harder, because it was more about like cleanness and perfection, and it was way more tedious and boring.
So talking now about the music, because like the music by Moana Urima, like that's also another big driving force in the film, because the music for that also changes from the beginning from the first half of the film to the second half, where Tehura goes into her dance, and that's where you also get the emotionality. That's where you feel a lot of the emotion, like the anger. Like it starts out like the drums are really intense, and they're you can feel that is about her anger, and I think also a bit of sadness too. Like you said, like there's like a bit of healing at the end, but there's all like sadness is also very usually tied to anger as emotion.
Totally.
Like they're usually very combined, and for her in this case, she's angry, but she's also sad about the connection that she lost, that she kind of like pulled away from her community. Because there's a very scene, it's one of the few scenes with dialogue, where she's after the first performance, she's in the dressing room and she's talking with to the other dancers. She's like, how come we don't dance the way we used to dance when we were kids? And the other dancers like, it's just a performance. And this is also, I think, where, because they're speaking in French, because in Tahiti, like the main language is French, not because of colonization or the annexation, because honestly and truly, like they never ceded. Like French was just like, we claim you now. But they said this is the official language, and that's where it also hits home that the other problem she has with losing touch with her culture is they're speaking in French. They're not speaking in native Tahitian. Like they've been made to speak a language that is not indigenous to their country. So like there's all of these layers and subtext to the story, and that one scene says so much about who she is and who her people are. And like sometimes you feel very isolated if like you're if you're a person that's like, I don't like injustice, I want things to change, and then there's other people like they're not necessarily they're satisfied with the status quo, but they've accepted it. They're like, this is just how life is now. This is what it is to be a Tahitian now. And for her, she's like, but we should not be like this. We should still try to keep in touch with our culture, in touch with our history, and in touch with our people. And you can tell she feels a bit isolated like that, because she's like, why don't my friends, these other dancers, feel the same way I do? So that's where a lot of the sadness also comes. So the music plays a big part in translating her emotions as well. So talk about working with the musician and how that ties into you working as an animator. We talked a bit about the dancing. So like talking now about choreographing the dance to the music, because it has to follow the music. And it also like, this is also something as a storyboard artist you wouldn't have had to do before, like work with music. And now you're like, now I got to work with movement, but I also got to work with music too.
Yes. Yeah. It was very challenging, and I was kind of just developing the process as I went. So like I mentioned, I went the first time and choreographed the dance once, and I came home and I tried to storyboard it, and I storyboarded the best I could. And then the second trip, I brought it back to Nahima, and we looked at it, we discussed it. There was this initial idea of incorporating some contemporary dance, like modern dance as well, so make it a bit fusiony. But then we scrapped that idea when I discussed it with Nahima. Just wanted to keep it as authentic to Ote'a Tahiti dance as possible. And then so we re-choreographed it based on this temp music that she suggested, or she actually referred to me to a musician that I talked to and borrowed some music from him. And so we choreographed it. And then I worked with Moana. I showed Moana the dance, both the animatic, both the storyboards as well as Nahima's choreography, and told him the story and whatnot. And so he was a one-person army. Okay, he did all the drums. There were like 4 or 5 different musical instruments, and he would just record each one individually while listening to his previous recording. He was a whole orchestra, and he did it in like 2 hours. He was so good, so professional. Even the sound engineer was like, whoa, this person really knows what he's doing. And so yeah, we tried to capture the emotionality. We talked a lot. We talked for like we spent a day talking about the film, and had dinner together, just trying to be on the same mindset before the recording session. And then I went back to Nahima to be like, now here's the music. Can you perform the choreography to this music? Then recorded it again, and then went home and storyboarded the whole thing.
It was a whole process.
Yeah, the whole process. But I think, I can't take credit for the emotionality of the music. That was all Moana. And his ability to understand what I was going for.
The music is beautiful. And another aspect of the film where sound is also important is there's a lot of quietness in the film. Like this is a very short film. It's about like 10-11 minutes long, but there is moments where like the length it feels like a longer film. And this is a good thing, because it just lets you sit in the quiet moments of the film, like where after she's done her dance of rebellion and reclamation, she's exhausted, she's breathing heavy. This is another indication that these dances take so much out of you. Like you mentioned the Heva, like the Heva shows like it's about the culture, but it also shows that these aspects of their culture are like athletic events, like
Yeah.
dancing is an athletic event, and it takes a lot of athleticism. It takes a lot of stamina and endurance, and even for very short dance, because their bodies are always constantly moving in these dances, it just takes a lot out of you. And so she's there on a balcony, and she's just breathing heavy, she's exhausted, and like the rain is falling. And then that's like one of the really quiet moments of the film, and where she's just like you talked about, it's a moment of healing, and it is. I read it as it's a moment of healing, and it's a moment of release for her, because the dance is also about release. I think perhaps of any, not only the anger and the sadness, but I think of maybe any guilt she could have had about giving up her culture to become a performer for these tourists, these concerts. To copy Shuri in Black Panther. She's like, hey, my favorite colonizer, but it's kind of the same. It's kind of the same thing, like you for some people, they could feel like they're betraying their culture and their people by becoming an entertainer for these people who've commodified their culture for their own entertainment. Like they'll only be there for a short time and go back home to their lives. While the effects of that and the consequences of that stay with the people who have to stay and live on these islands. So there's so much that a lot of people who, if they're not from like cultures like Tahiti, or from a culture where tourism is considered a main import and export, like there's a lot of things that come along with that emotionally. So this one scene is very sharp. I think this is how I read everything into the scene, but there's so much to it. And then you have the guy come up and he's apologizing, and I'm like, dude, nobody wants to hear you. Go away.
Yes.
So the film kind of ends with her after she's had this moment for herself. It shows this very beautiful scene at the end where she's now stepping in place of her ancestors and the chief, and she's now training the future generations of dancers. She's showing a little girl the dance, and it's a very beautiful parallel to the flashback scenes that she had. And it's like now she's the teacher. So talk a bit about that. And then also when the film was done, like when you showed it to like Moana and I want to pronounce it. Hima, like what were their reactions to that? So talk about the whole theme of like teaching the future generations, and then what they thought of the film when you showed it.
Yeah, it's the teaching of the future generation is something that I saw a lot in Tahiti. The dance groups span all ages. It's a place where elders as well as youths gather, and they the people that I talk to, they tell me a bit of the history of how at one point not a lot of young people wanted to get into the dance, but then recently there's been a resurgence to do that, to reconnect with their roots, especially a lot of people like Nahima who traveled around the world and realized how amazing and beautiful Tahiti is, and it really is. It's incredible. It's an incredible place, and so when they return, they have that desire to reconnect with their roots, and so that's really what inspired that last scene. And he mentioned something else. Now I forgot what I was going to say.
Sorry, sometimes I tend to do it. Sometimes I go on a bit too long in my comments. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You mentioned so much, and I'm so happy about you sharing all the things that you see and your interpretations, because I'm just like, yes, that's exactly what yes, 100%.
Yeah, I talked a bit about the sadness, like after the anger and the healing, like I mentioned the sadness in the film, because she is like sad, like this says anger and sadness come together, but there's also like this sense of guilt and with regards to losing connection to her culture and her people, and also feeling possibly isolated because she's the one that's come to this revelation, and her other friends don't feel that the same way that she does.
Yeah, that's possibly one of the, and that was definitely influenced by Nahima's story as well. She mentioned to me how in the group where it's more about performing for trying to bring Ote'a Tahiti to the global stage and making it more of a globally recognized show. In that group, she mentioned that for the Heva, there are many components to it, right? Most of it is group competition, but there is one part of the competition that is the solo dancers. So each group chooses one woman to compete and then one man to compete. And in the, I'll just call it the more modern group. The more modern group, it's more like here where dancers were like, I want to be the representative of our group. And then someone's like, I want to be the representative. So it's more individualized and competitive. Whereas in her traditional, the group that she eventually went to reconnect with her roots, it's more communal. It's more community based. No one would dare. You're not supposed. People don't just step out and say, I want to do this. It's the group somehow arrives at the consensus, like, oh, you know what? We think you should do it.
Yeah.
So she was chosen by the group. She didn't say, I want to do it. She was chosen by the group. And so it's more about, those two contrasting experiences of hers and how individualism is influencing their culture too, right? For better or worse. And so that's just it's funny. It's because I feel like as we talk, I realize that the film is made up of all these little tiny moments and each little tiny moment has a huge backstory behind it, based on these other things that I've experienced and heard of. And I don't know if you can get all of that in those little moments, but maybe just even a hint of it is, if the audience gets a hint of it, I feel very satisfied. So
you did it. So what were their reactions to the film? Like,
that's right. Yeah. So Nahima, we've become such good friends. So the film was premiered in Tribeca, and so she actually flew out to New York from Tahiti for the premiere. So we got to spend quite a bit of time together and watch on the big screen together. She had already seen it before that, but it's different to see it with your choreographer, right? So, this whole festival run, it's been great, but it's also not as satisfying as I thought it would be, in the sense that I realized sitting with Nahima and watching it and like seeing her feeling proud of the film, that is so much more meaningful than everything else, and that makes me realize that maybe I've been contemplating about going back to Tahiti to show the film, maybe at the next Heva for 2023, because at the end of the day, the film is for them. Like I said, it's to reciprocate what they shared with me.
You should go back and show it to them. I think they love it, especially for the younger kids too, because as an animator, like, now that you're an animator, it's another, I think it's a way to show them that this is just another avenue, another method that for the younger generation, to show like this is a way that they can also honor their culture. This is also another way that they can to honor their own people, and to show like this is, because like art is also a very big part of Tahitian and Polynesian culture and Pacifica culture. So like you could be like, this is also where you guys can also show your art, like this is how you meld the dancing and the music and the visual art together.
Nahima and I talked about, if I was to go back, it'd be cool if I ran some animation classes to give back. And that sounds I'm super into that. She's so down. She's so great. She's so down with any. I mean, that's the thing. It's like that's the Tahitian attitude. They're always just so down to collaborate artistically without any kind of like, what is it for? You know, what how much you're gonna get paid, or like what kind of reputation. It's just art for art's sake is it's assumed by them, you know. It's just, so I love that. Yeah.
Do it. One of the last things I want to talk a bit about is just so like we've talked about how the film is about colonization and colonialism, so which is a political it is politics. It's a political aspect of the film. So when you were researching the film and researching the culture and the dance and everything, what were the what's the word I want to say? Did any like you said that she talked about her own personal struggles with connecting to her culture. Were there any discussions with regard to the politics of like just regaining their own culture, just regaining their own ancestry away from the commercialization of it? Like what was the kind of discussions that you guys had? Because that's a very it's a very nuanced and a very subtle aspect of the film, but it's there if people pay attention, and it is the reason for why you changed your why you decided this is what I want to make the film about.
Yeah, actually it was Mate, the person who I stayed with, that really, the person who told the story of his grandmother, that I discussed about colonialism with a lot. He would say that like he spent 5 years in France going to school studying art there, and he would say that he doesn't feel French. You know, he feels Polynesian. He feels more akin with, you know, Hawaii and the Samoa Islands. Like he feels more connected with Polynesia than to France. And so yeah, it's through talks with him that really shine a light on the complexities of colonialism, of modern Tahiti, because he's also very, you know, it's obvious that he's very educated, and you know a lot of his education is from France, and he does live in an absolute beautiful modern house that has Tahitian design elements influence like fused into it. He himself is very mixed, you know, he's Chinese, Tahitian, French, everything. And so to be able to live with him for a while, for that period, to see how he approaches life in every sense, you know, you see the complexity of how colonialism is part of his life, but also this anger towards it as well. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. And
it answers it, because like the even the dance that Tehura dances at the end, like I didn't mention this before, but she did it in the same auditorium where she was performing earlier. She goes back on the same stage and she performs this truly cultural and truly emotional, truly visceral dance in front of the tourists, you know, instead of in front of the same two men who were objectifying her. That in itself is not only a statement of rebellion, but it's also a political statement, because she's showing the people that are there, this is who we are, this is who my people are, this is who I am, you know, like she's showing this isn't the polished perfect performance that we perform time again over and over and over multiple times, you know, like every night they perform the same dance but for different people. So it's like it's kind of lost meaning and sense, but she's like, this is who we are. And that's a political statement. That's an act of rebellion, you know, because like this isn't for people who, again, who might not understand, like for anyone who's in a culture like that to come out and perform just rawness in front of their guests, the tourists. Like, that's not what the tourists expected. That's not what the tourists want. That's not what they're paying to see. And it's an act of political rebellion. It's a statement, like rebellion and a political statement isn't everything like drawing up a just like a long memorandum or whatever. It's just an act of saying, like, asserting your own identity. And that's what the film happens. And like what you're saying, it's a very confusing thing, especially like for me. I'm an immigrant. I live in Canada, and like I'm always cognizant of the fact that the land that I live on now, the land I call my second home, is a settler colonial estate. It's unceded territory. The indigenous people are very much marginalized on their own land. I'm always aware of that I am, and that's why I'm proud to call myself an immigrant, not only because it reminds people and reminds myself that I'm from Barbados. I have our own home, which has its own complicated past with slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, but that I know that I am not of this land. This is not my home, So like when I do what I can to like uplift like indigenous voices, like on Twitter, like if I see any protest, whatever, I retweet it, because this is a way of helping them to let their voices be heard, and so like film like this is another way of doing that. Like at Relation, there's a documentary that I saw. Oh my gosh, why am I drawing a blank? My brain. It's about this. The Sinnet, I believe, is a tradition. It's an indigenous native First Nations group, and the film is talking about this whole complicated past and like how they have to assert their own dominance on their own land. How they have to speak against the colonialists on their own land. They have to say, "You're on my property. This is my land," but they're still in this fight to be recognized as indigenous people on their own land. So like the film like touches on that, like that she's reminding these people that's watching her, you're a tourist, you're a visitor, you're a guest on my own land, but then she's still speaking with a tongue that is not of her people. So it's very complicated and very complex. And like your friend, like he has all of that. Like that's this whole complicated idea of who he is, like you did answer the question, and I think you kind of like pay respect to that within the film itself because it's there.
I hope so. Yeah. No, thanks so much. I feel like wanting to make dances as political statements is, I don't know, it's something that I want to keep trying to do, or expressions of the body, maybe not just dance, but it can be so much more powerful, like you said, than just words, it's interesting to hear you describe her, how you interpreted her on stage. And I'm so happy about that interpretation. I feel like that's the most generous interpretation you could give me. Because for me, it was, the original objective was just for her to reclaim her own body. And I was like, oh, should she dance her final dance on that stage? It feels so much more like, once again, it's for the audience. And that's why you never see in her final dance, you never see any lens from the audience perspective. You never see like an over the shoulder of the audience or from that viewpoint. It just stays with her. And I almost pretty much ignore the audience because I wanted to stay away from that as much as possible. But yeah, what you're saying, the idea of her reclaiming not just her body, but the whole stage and even the resort in of itself. And I guess that's part of what the rain was meant to, and the storm was meant to represent as well, the drowning of the stage. So yeah, I'm so happy that that's what you got out of it.
Yeah. So as we wrap it now, so the last thing I want to ask you is like, how has the film changed your perspective of filmmaking and animation in general, but also your how you perceive yourself now as a filmmaker? Because like for a first film, and for whether short or feature length or animated or live action, like your first film says a lot about who you are as a filmmaker. It says a lot about who you want to be as a filmmaker. So what do you think this film says about you as a filmmaker, and like where do you want to go next?
Yeah. So it made me realize I don't want to make another animated film like this, where I animate everything by myself. I do not want that.
Oh, yeah.
It made me realize the most rewarding part of the film was working with the Tahitian community. It wasn't, the endless nights of animating. And, it made me realize that even though I love to draw and love to make visual art, I think it made me realize a more powerful artistic medium that I'm now exploring is community building. That has nothing to do with filmmaking, really, or it has to do with storytelling, but in a very different way. It's nothing to do with this, like creating a product of a film piece and then presenting it in these institutions. It has nothing to do with that. What the experience taught me is really wanting to bring that approach to community that I learned in Tahiti, to carry that with me as not just a filmmaker, but as a person, that using that medium in all parts of my life. And so, now I've been more involved in the climate movement here in Vancouver, and that is my medium through which I try to express that. And I'm still writing my next project, but it's going to be like a hybrid of comics and that's some panels animated. But with that, I'm still exploring body politics and making political statements with narratives of the body.
Great. That's great. I can't wait to see what you do next. Honestly, I really can. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, Wei. This was great.
Yeah. Thank you so much for telling me all about how you interpreted the film and giving so much thought. Yeah. I really enjoyed this.